Hello and good morning. My name is Lisa Heithmar. I am a student at Rutgers University studying in ecology, evolution, and natural resources. So we're the group of people who have been checking everyone in and will be around all day. This presentation is Scoop and Dump Soil Remediation, Bringing Back Trashed Soil. Dr. Nina Basuk is a professor and program leader of the Urban Horticultural Institute at Cornell University. She's on the board of directors of the New York State Urban Forest Council and is co-author of Trees in the Urban Landscape. In addition, Dr. Basuk has authored over 100 papers on the physiological problems of plants growing in urban environments, including improved plant selection, soil modification, and transplanting technology. She works closely with municipalities to help implement best practices in urban forestry management. Please welcome Dr. Nina Basuk.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I thank the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation for inviting me to come here. I can't remember, I was talking to Jason yesterday, 20 years since I've spoken to this group, maybe more, but I'm delighted to be here. So, bringing back trash soil. I'm not sure anybody's ever seen trash soil in your work. But we're going to be talking about basically 22 years of research and how we can implement best practices for shade trees in urban environments. Hello? It's not going forward. Can someone forward the slides to me, for me? Yeah. It worked before. Okay. Well, I'm sure, yeah, someone can do it for me. It's all right. So, I'm sure all of you are aware of all the tree planting initiatives that are going on around the country and around the world. 1,000 million trees in New York City, and millions of trees in Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, and Chicago. Lots of tree planting initiatives. There we go. That's all laudable, and I really applaud that, and I support that. But what we're finding that, and which we knew before, is that tree planting in itself won't do the job, won't get the job done unless you deal with soil as well. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the soil issues and how that affects tree growth. Are you going to do it for me? Or? Okay, so you see basically the effects of construction. This is a well-known campus in Ithaca, New York, which I happen to be part of. But you'll see that the effects of development, construction, utility, this happens to the soil, and then all those players move away, and it gets covered with a little bit of turf, and we think everything is fine. We go to actually planting trees into compacted soil, we find other issues. Next, please. So what first we need to do when we're trying to establish trees is to do a site assessment. What do we got? What are we dealing with? Is the soil great? Is the soil terrible? What about our sun and shade? Cold, hot, microclimates, all kind of pH of the soil, all kinds of things we need to understand before we're going to make the best tree selection for that site. And so we have opportunities, we have limitations whenever we look at a site. Next, please. And how would you go from this to, next slide, to this? It's the same site many years later. And it just wasn't planting great plants and trees and shrubs, it was dealing with the soil to allow this to happen. Next, please. So, compaction. Compaction is ubiquitous around the world in urban areas where there's been human impact on the landscape. This happens no matter where we are, no matter what climate we're in. Soil compaction is the biggest problem we deal with. And also, because the soil has so much to do with providing water, nutrients, root growth, oxygen, all these things are mediated by the soil. So this is typical brick-like soil in areas that we're going to be planting in. Next, please. And we want this. We want the kind of little beds and spaces where we're going to have water holding ability as also water drainage. So that kind of two-part aspect is really key. Next, please. So there's strategies for dealing with compacted soils. We can protect the soil prior to construction. This is the best idea. The critical root zone, CRZ, is we can actually, where we are dealing with trees, where we're going to be planting trees, if we can protect the soil, not just the tree itself, that's always the best option. But we can also, we need to calculate the amount of soil we need to remediate or allow for trees to grow to what we envision in terms of the design size. We can create breakout zones from bad soil to good soil, and there's some neat ways of doing that. And we can raise beds in terms of burying the soil, creating a raised profile to have better soil on top of poor soil. And we can replace the soil, which is something often happens, but it's not it's a very sustainable way of dealing with things. And finally, we're going to be talking about amending in place, or the scoop and dump method. Now, we started working with this in about 2000 on the campus of Cornell, and we have a lot of research to show you about what scoop and dump really means. Next, please. So first, there's issues of volume. Okay, so we're looking at Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., willow oaks planted in large volume of soil and turf, and the ones on the left in vaults, actually in vaults suspended from the sidewalk. So you see the result of volume on plant growth. And what we're trying to do when we talk about scoop and dump, which you'll find out, is to create more usable volume for trees to grow in. Next. So how much soil does a tree need? And then this is going through the last slide of a long presentation about how you calculate this. But in general, we say about 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot of crown projection. Now, crown projection is just the area under the drip line. So it's, if you've shown a light on top of the tree, the shadow there would be the crown projection. And about 2 cubic feet per square foot of crown projection. That's what you envision, okay? It's not the tree as you're putting it in the ground, but we're looking at what we hope to have in 30 years and preparing the soil for that time. Next. So there are study sites. This is the Ag Quad at Cornell University. And in my class, as you'll see, which I taught for 20 years or so, 22 years, we would always end up a 2-semester class with a project on campus where we would design it, we would assess it, design it, remediate if necessary, and plant it. And so there are many, many sites on the campus which we actually accomplished. And so we're looking at some sites on a campus. The blue ones were those that we remediated with scoop and dump, and the red ones were ones adjacent where no remediation was done. So you always have to have the good and the bad if you're doing research. Next. So what is the scoop and dump method? It's basically applying a layer of 6 to 8 inches of compost to compacted soil just on the surface, and using a bucket of a backhoe, scooping down to about 18 inches deep, lifting it up, and then dumping it on the ground. So what we end up with this is like veins of compost through the clods of the compacted soil. Bucket is lifted and compost dropped. Soil and compost mix is dropped from the ground and smooth, and landscape plants are planted directly into this kind of cloddy mixture. We then surface mulch every year until we get what's called canopy closure, which is where their leaves are touching themselves in a landscape bed. So next, please. Okay, let's just show a little video of the process. Hopefully we can, yep. So I'm going to narrate this. There's really not much sound here, but this is a project we did in 2014, and we're doing a bioswale here. You can see the students laying the compost on this bioswale. It's actually quite a deep area next to parking lots, which are being used as bioswale to collect water from those parking lots. And always good to have 40 students to do this, but yeah, it always rains when we're out there. But you can see how deep that is, you know. And a good thick layer of compost, not just a smattering, about That's to say 6 inches. And then we get the backhoe in there with a bucket, and the backhoe is lifting, going down about 18 inches, lifting the soil and the compost, and then dropping it in the ground. Notice that there's some yellow flags around the existing trees, so we don't want to scoop and dump the roots of the trees, so we have some using the critical root zone to keep away from those roots. And we do the scoop and dump moving away from where we've just mixed the soil so that we can not go over what we've just prepared. And here's what it looks like. It's pretty rough, but it's basically what it looks like after we have the scoop and dump. We then have put our project plans. We've decided what's going to go in, for what reason. Students are placing them, and they dig them in. Now the soil is a bit easier to dig because we've just made it much softer. And then mulching afterwards. About 2 to 3 inches of shredded bark mulch to add a little bit of organic matter over time. And the planting is complete here of April 2014. So some things are starting to bud out, but most things are still dormant. And these are 3 interconnected bioswales near a parking lot, which the parking lot runoff is being channeled into these areas. So 4 months later, we're now in September, and plants are growing pretty well. But we're not at that canopy closure part. We wouldn't have expected to be in the first year in any case. But you can see there's plants are growing well after being placed in this scooped and dumped area. So that's the inlet where the water is moving into the bioswales. So 14 months later, now we're into July of 2015. And you can see a lot more growth. I mean, this is pretty impressive for the first year. We're not at canopy closure, but we're pretty close there. And water is moving into those bioswales, and it's being filtered and allowed to go into the ground plane, groundwater. So next July of 2016, we're basically there. We've got full planting, canopy closure, for the most part, 90% or so. Lots of different diversity of plants, which we chose for that soil type. We have to do in terms of soil pH and so on. And the plants are growing really well. Why canopy closure is so important is that when we eventually move away from that, the leaves that fall are going to create more organic matter and not let that organic matter, that substantial amount of organic matter, subside into the soil. Thank you. So we really want to make sure that we get, also with canopy closure, we don't get very many weeds because the plants are shading out the soil and we don't get weed growth. So it's both from a maintenance standpoint and from a physiological standpoint, good to have those leaves touch each other. So we had, we were looking at this from, maybe 22 years, but I had a student who worked on 13 years of this process, and we used the Cornell soil health test, where we looked at the biological, physical, and chemical aspects of the soil after this process had been done. So what happened? What happened to the soil? Is it good? Is it bad? We didn't know what's happening with the soil. So let's look at the next sheet, which is the next slide, which is a score sheet, which you get from this Cornell health test. And you can see at the bottom is the chemical aspects, phosphorus, micronutrients, so on. And you can see it's pretty good. This is stoplight colors. Green is good, yellow is moderate, and red is really bad. And often when we look at a soil test, we're looking at the chemical aspects. We say, I want to get a soil test to see how the soil is. Just looking at the chemical aspects of the soil is not nearly sufficient in terms of looking at the health of the soil. So if you look above the chemical aspects at the bottom, you can then get into the biological aspects, that the root pathogen pressure, organic matter, protein index, how much microorganisms there are, and then we get into the physical aspects of the surface hardness and bulk density and so on. And you can see the physical and biological aspects of the soil were pretty poor red and yellow, as opposed to just looking at chemical alone is not getting the full picture. So we would do these tests on all our different soils in our project area. Next, please. So here's scoop and dump again next to a building on the campus. Keep going, please. And this is one of the tests that we would do. Is called aggregate stability. This is a really critical test. So when you have a natural soil that has aggregates, the sand, silt, and clay is glued together by the excrement of microorganisms and organic matter and into PEDs, or crumbles or crumbs, which allow water and air to move through and root growth to grow through. And when you have compaction, often those PEDs are crushed and you get physical impedance and no drainage. So this is just showing an example from a plowed or no-till or plowed field. On the left, we had a sieve full of soil, and we had a rain event. See the rain event infiltrometer on the left. Having a rain event on those sieves and how much melts through the sieve, it means that it's not stable. Those PEDs are being basically disassociated and moving through the sieve. On the right, you see the same amount of soil to start with, but the PEDs are holding up to the water event and remaining in their aggregate shapes. And that's what we want. The aggregate is important in order to really remediate the soil. It's just not enough to fluff it up. We need to have those aggregates to allow for water and water movement, air movement, and root growth. So in this case, we had 22% stability for the the plowed field, where we had basically 78% washed through, was not stable, and about the reverse when we had the no-till soil, where we had a lot of stability in those aggregates. So let's look at what we found in the scoop and dump. Next, please. So with the scoop and dump, aggregate stability was up to 70%. So that was incredibly high. That means that once you put the compost in, you have the microorganisms doing the heavy lifting, you get these aggregates, which are going to help for water, air, and root growth. In our unamended soil, we had very little, about 30% of aggregate stability. Next, please. So organic matter. Of course, we're adding a lot of organic matter with the compost, so you would expect there to be more organic matter in the scoop and dump, which we found. Next, please. There we have about 80% or 8% organic matter and about 3% organic matter in the non-remediated stuff. So we're getting it high. This is by weight, so 8% is pretty high, 3% is fairly low. Next. So organic matter is in various different fractions. There's one thing called active carbon. Active carbon is that portion of organic matter which is the food for the microorganisms which are going to be doing the heavy lifting of creating aggregates and making the soil healthy. So we looked at active carbon in the organic matter fracture. Next, please. And you can see the scoop and dump with all the compost that's put in and the microorganisms. Actually, the compost is breaking down and giving food for the microorganisms. That's the active carbon. And in the unamended, we had very low active carbon. Well, this is really important because this gives you the aggregates when you have microorganisms doing the work. Next. And water holding capacity. Obviously, we're adding more organic matter. You expect more water holding capacity. But so we had, 23% available water in the scoop and dump and about 15% in the unamended. This is a heavy soil, silt loam, silt clay loam, so we'd expect to have reasonable water holding capacity. Next. And we looked at resistance, how, if you ever use a penetrometer, it's a simple field tool, which is basically a point that's pushed into the soil and it measures in PSI, pounds per square inch. And if you get over 200 to 300 PSI, roots cannot penetrate the soil. So we're looking at the usable depth of soil, and the penetrometer gives us that reading right away. Next. So again, scoop and dump, much better. We would basically dug up the soil. We expect much greater penetration. Next, please. And here you can see the bulk density, which is another test we took where we're taking an undisturbed core and we're looking at the density of the soil, the weight per volume of the soil. That's really critical, as we found that the bulk density of the soil is the most important factor driving soil health and plant growth. So we typically say that if you have a texture or a sand texture, the limit is about 1.7 grams per cubic centimeter. If you have a silt or clay, heavier soil, about 1.4 grams per cubic centimeter. These are kind of the thresholds we've come to see from the literature, and we wanted to look at where our soils were within those ranges. Next, please. So our scoop, this is where we want a low value, which is basically a lighter soil in that volume. So we have 0.89 grams per cubic centimeter in the scoop and dump, where we have 1.5 centimeters grams per cubic centimeter in the unamended. So really heavy for that soil texture, very limiting in terms of root growth. Next, please. I'll get out of these slides in just a minute. So those are sort of the basic slides, data we took over all the different sites we looked at. But we wanted to look at what happens over time. So from day 0, you just scooped and dumped, and you planted, and what happened 12 years ago. So we wanted to see what happens over time, and this is kind of an interesting thing. Next, please. So we're looking at the bottom, we're looking at years from 0 to 12 years out, and then we're looking at the bulk density. And I expected, as soon as you first scoop and dump, that would be the lightest time you'd have, the bulk density would be the lightest. But in fact, although it was reduced, which is good, it got better over time. And this was really unusual. I thought, well, over time, you're going to lose some organic matter, but we're putting it back in with the mulch and the leaves that we leave in the beds. But in fact, over time, the aggregates are doing their work. They're creating PEDs and aggregates and reducing the density of that soil. So over time, over 12 years, we actually get improvement in the density of the soil after having done this initial injection of compost. Next, please. And active carbon. We want this to increase. This is the fraction of organic matter, which is the food for microorganisms. So we got actually increasing of the active carbon as the compost breaks down into simple forms that the microorganisms can eat. Next, please. And so we needed to we looked at the soil, we looked at the health of the soil, but wanted to see how plants, although the plants in our beds that we planted looked good, it wasn't an experiment. So we thought we'd actually take PVC cores and pound them into the ground in unamended sites and in those that were amended. So we took these PVC cores, and you can see them being tamped into the ground, removing the turf, getting the soil as it was unamended versus that was amended. Next, please. And we used Ficus benjamina as a test or bioassay for this because we were doing it in the wintertime. We needed something that was going to grow over winter. And we had the plugs of ficus. We just basically cored out a little bit of soil from those PVC soil areas and put the ficus in there and then grew them in a bioswale, or basically in a growth chamber. Next, please. So they were in the growth chamber, and they grew them over about 3 or 4 months. So they were, some were in scooped and dumped soil, and some were in control or non-amended soil. Next, please. And we had to look at, we started looking at leaf area and root growth and what were the plants doing. So in the scoop and dump, we had basically almost twice as much leaf area as we did in the non-amended soil. Next, please. And also in terms of dry weight of roots, considerable amount more roots in the amended soil versus the control. Next. Bulk density. This is the thing that keeps on coming up. When you have a lower bulk density, the weight per volume of soil, you have better plant growth. And here we see you have a high bulk density in the unamended soil, which is, we don't want that. We want a low bulk density, and here it is about 0.97 grams per cubic centimeter versus 1.6 or 1.7, which is really limiting for root growth. Next, please. So interestingly, we always think about a threshold for bulk density, that if it's over this, plants can't grow or roots can't grow. If it's under this, it's good. But what we found, looking at leaf area and bulk density, at the bottom you see bulk density as it starts low and then goes high. And on the y-axis, on the left-hand axis, you see amount of leaf area. So as the bulk density increases, you get less and less leaf area. And there's that line between the pink and the blue blobs, which is so-called threshold. But in fact, it's a regression. The less you have bulk density, it's not like it's all great and then you have a threshold and then it's all poor. It's a regression of lighter bulk density has the best shoot growth versus higher bulk density as the worst shoot growth. So this was interesting. It's not been reported before. Next, please. And the same thing we found as the bulk density increased, the dry weight of shoots decreased. Next, please. And here we actually destructively harvested these cores. And on the top, you'll see the unamended root growth, and at the bottom, you see the scoop and dump. Next. So interestingly, we had the original plugs going into those cores, but the roots that grew from the ficus into the unamended just went along the surface of the core and then went down the sides of the core. Couldn't actually access the soil in the core. So basically roots were avoiding the compacted soil. Next, please. And this was the roots in the amended soil. Basically, they are totally exploring the soil volume, growing through the PEDs, lots of aggregate stability, and we're getting a much different root system. Next, please. So the dry weight of roots, again, many more roots in the lower bulk density than in the higher bulk density. Next. So, take-home message in this soil resistance decreases. That's important. You can't just plant a hole, chisel a hole into the ground, plant your plant, and expect the roots to get out into that really dense soil. You have to prepare a site where the roots are going to actually grow. The pore volume increases, more water and air exchange, improve bulk density, reducing the bulk density, increasing the carbon and nitrogen with the compost, improve soil structure and aggregate stability. That's the PEDs that the microorganisms form. And we have long-term improvement of soil over time, which is really key. Now, some people say, well, you're adding all that organic matter, you're going to have subsidence. But because we mulch until we get canopy closure, so we're adding organic with mulching, and then canopy closure, the leaves fall into the beds, and we don't rake the leaves out. We only rake leaves on grass. But in those landscape beds, we leave the leaves because they're going to increase the organic matter. Next, please. We also did, I'm going to have to look, well, we're going to add in compost. What compost? We did a whole study on looking at a spec for compost that would work well in this situation without leaching too much phosphorus or nitrogen into the groundwater. So we had 5 or 8 different compost types, different feedstocks, from food, green waste, and manure-based compost. And we looked at a bioassay. Next, please. There's that line. The black line is the soil alone growth of beans. Next, please. So those are the beans growing in the compost mixtures, 100% compost, 50% compost, 33% compost, or no compost, and all the different feedstocks. And so we came up with a spec so that we could say to people, well, you need to put compost on these sites, but this is the spec for it. Next, please. Which is on my website, and it's basically looking at some of the aspects which were key, and especially if you're concerned about leaching of phosphorus and nitrogen. So if you're not concerned about leaching, the phosphorus, nitrogen can be higher, but there's many places where leaching is a concern near bodies of water. Next, please. So going back, let's look at what happened. Here's that site on Cornell campus where they had 3 years of construction on the quad while they were redoing the building. Next, please. And that's when they were just about finished. You can see the soil in front of the building there. There's still dumpsters and trucks and all kinds of equipment. It's starting to pull out from that site. Next, please. And then we did a scoop and dump of this is the same site in front of the library where we did, this is the first year of growth after we scooped and dumped and planted appropriate plants in that site. Next, please. This is 2 years later. So we're getting into canopy closure here. It's what we wanted to have. So we don't have to start to continue mulching after this point. And next slide, please. So this is another 2 3 years, and it looks like this at now. So this is where we had, basically a concrete soil, and through scoop and dump, we were able to, and appropriate plants, we were able to bring it to this kind of effect. I'll show you another one. Next, please. This was a site on the campus, which was, you can see on the left, there's this newer building. This was a building that was created there, and the dewatering trucks of the concrete and asphalt would actually use this site to dump their waste in. And campus said, well, why don't you create a garden there? I said, well. So we looked at the site. Next, please. And this is what after a rain, nothing moved, nothing drained. After a week, you come back, it still looks like this. So we expect that with high compaction levels. Next, please. We get that blue-gray glade. It's called glade soil, where there's no oxygen, and you get this blue-gray color. You can see that no structure, no aggregates in the soil. Next, please. And it got worse before it got better. We were digging into this soil, and it just was total trash. I can use the term. We wanted to create a garden here. So next, please. We started to do scoop and dump and actually raised up the soil too, because we were having to have paths through this, which we wanted to be compacted, but we used scoop and dump, created raised beds. Next, please. And planted them on this site. Next, please. And that's the original site. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like now. Next. So that's the site now. Next slide, please. That's what the site looks like. Next, please. I mean, the amount of growth you can get with preparing the soil is extraordinary. And, of course, it's choosing the right plants. Next, please. So this was that same site that we just saw, that triangle of where the soil was totally trashed. Next, please. So just the most recent work I've done is to use the scoop and dump on street tree plantings in tree lawns. And this was, I planted Gymnocladus dioicus, Kentucky coffee tree in 2019, the fall of 2019. 1.5-inch caliper, bare root, in really bad soils next to car dealerships. And even though it looks like it's, can you go back please for a minute? Yeah, even though it looks like there's a tree lawn there, the soil was just brick-like. We tested it. But we had pairs, 6 different pairs, so 12 trees. One of the pairs was scooped and dumped. In other words, we took a backhoe, put the compost down, put a backhoe, and went 10 feet on either side of the tree, scooped and dumped, and then we planted the tree in the middle of that. And the other tree on the right is basically a typical control planting where you're just digging a hole and planting the tree right in it. So you can see the difference in growth where you have, just after 3 years, after you have a scoop and dump in a tree lawn versus that in a without scoop and dump, in a compacted soil. Next, please. So also the root growth in these scooped and dumped, it was just extraordinary. You get this really flourishing of root growth, very rapid root growth where the soil has been amended, versus that on the right where the soil has not been amended. Next, please. And a last example. This is a south-facing brick wall in a leftover area next to a development. It's about on an 85-degree day, there'd be 125 degrees coming off of this wall. Really hot, dry. And so we had some ash trees planted there that defoliated several times over the year. It would get too hot and dry. The leaves would drop. It would rain again. The leaves would come back. it would happen 2 or 3 times during the year. And we thought, well, how can we actually make this better? We have a really hot condition. And the soil, of course, was just left over from the building. There was no preparation. There was some grass put on it. Well, we got rid of the grass right away because that's a competitor for water. And we scooped and dumped between the trees, careful not to damage too many of the roots of those ash trees that we see being pretty crispy there. And then 2 years later, we can see the next slide. That's what it looked. The same trees, just add more volume so that roots can actually get the water and oxygen that they need. So that is my last slide. I urge you to look at my website, blogs.cornell.edu/urban-hort. There's a lot of information. There's videos, there's bulletins, there's research, there's all kinds of things that would be useful, and I urge you to look at those things so that you can, and there's also a woody plant database, a searchable database for plants for different types of conditions. And I thank you for your attention. I hope there are any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. This is inspiring. So if you're planting a street tree and you're constrained to a treatment, that there's just, treatment in concrete is not
Yeah.
presumably, what would you recommend? I don't know.
Yeah, that's another, when you're surrounded by pavement, concrete, asphalt, whatever, you can't do scoop and dump other than a little bit in the pit itself. But we have something called structural soil, which Jason Grabowski and I worked on, which is soil that you put under pavement, can be compacted, and roots can actually access that. So this scoop and dump doesn't work when you have pavement because the soil underneath the pavement needs to be compacted to bear the load of the pavement. So. Well, I would still, first of all, I would hope to get as big an opening where the tree is going as possible, not 4 by 5. But I mean, New York City standard is 5 by 10. That's better. It's not great, but at least I would actually prepare the soil in that tree pit. So it's, sometimes the tree pit soil is just what has been used in underlaying the sidewalk, so that it has not been prepared. But if you can actually prepare the soil there, and of course you're going to have to think about water, because that's going to be the key aspect of not getting enough water in those small openings. Yes?
Can you do any kind of comparison between bare root trees versus B&B? Or
Yeah, we done comparison B&B and bare root. They, depending on the species, we have a lot of information on certain. We plant a lot of bare root trees. We actually dip them in hydrogel and put them in a plastic bag so they don't dry out from the nursery to the site where they're being planted. And we often plant bare root trees in Ithaca and many other places in New York State, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania do bare root planting. Sometimes some species just won't do well bare rooted, and we'll go to B&B or container. And we stay with a small size, which is 1.5 to 2 inch caliper for bare root. And also, some other research I've just recently shown is transplanting difficult, fall hazards and so on. If you stay small, 1.5 to 2 inches, you get a much better result in transplanting than if you go to 2.5 to 4 inch caliper. It really is a thing. Yes?
It's very compelling. I'm curious, though. The scoop and dump seems to be a analysis of 3 specific treatments concurrently. You have the mechanical disruption, incorporation of organic, top dress of organic. Have you run any experiments to tease out the relative efficacy of those 3 component treatments? And
yes.
Specifically, I'm curious about that long-term longitudinal. We
Yeah.
had an N of 30 going out 12 years.
Right.
Have you looked at any of that over the long term?
Well, we've looked at just mechanical disruption without any incorporation. And what happens when a compacted soil, it basically melts back into what it was. maybe over a couple of weeks, but with the actual rainfall, if you just fluff up the soil, it'll just basically disassociate and go back to what it was. So you have to put organic in there to actually create the spaces and the veins, we call it, to actually get the microorganisms moving and the roots going in there so that they actually start to improve the soil. We always do mulch initially, although in that street tree situation, the last slide, it was a city project. I worked with the city of Ithaca. They were nice enough to, I provided the compost, they provided the trees, and we did it. But I said, let's mulch it every year. It's better for the trees. The mower's not going to hit it. But they didn't. So there's benefit even without the mulch. And we're taking data on that street tree experiment now. But I think the mulch does help in terms of adding organic. But that's the only experiment I have done. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Questions about the mulching. I actually spoke with someone that worked at Longwood Gardens and was informed that they never use wood mulch. It's always leaf mulch, and it's because wood mulch takes nitrogen out of the ground, which I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It's when you incorporate fresh wood in the ground that you might be robbing nitrogen, not on the surface. So there's absolutely no reason not to use shredded bark. I mean, you can use leaf as well, but it's basically getting organic matter on the surface, not incorporating it. We incorporate the compost,
right,
but not the mulch. And the mulch is just there to retain water, get the weeds away, protect it from mowers, and adding organic matter over time. Yeah. Yes? Question?
In the tree pit urban situation, would you expect if you added compost to that area, would you expect the trees the roots to encircle and then eventually girdle the tree? Because of everywhere else being so compacted.
Well, that can happen, depending on, first of all, you need to make sure that they're not circling to begin with, either in B&B or bare root, so the tree architecture, root architecture should be good. But then when you, in a tree pit you're talking about? In a tree pit or? Yeah. Well, I mean, that can happen. It depends on if the roots actually get out. Typically, if roots get out of a tree pit opening, they're at the surface between that layer of weakness between the concrete and the base course. There's a gravel layer. So roots get out right at the surface, like 4 inches down, and that's when they do some damage with heaving the sidewalk, maybe. So girdling roots may happen, but it's not particularly because of the organic matter.
I have another question. Did anyone evaluate the actual organisms or species of organisms compared in the compacted soils versus the scoop and dump?
No, we haven't done that.
Okay.
No. Behind, yes?
Do you have a formula before you bring in the backhoe, as far as the existing trees there, how far from the crown you can come in and not be cutting the roots?
Yeah, we call it all the CRZ, the critical root zone. Typically, we look at the diameter, DBH, of the tree, and we call, let's say the DBH is 10 inches. We'll call that feet, and we'll say 10 feet radius away from the trunk, all the way around. So we have 10 foot on one side, so 20 foot diameter all the way around as a protection zone. And that's kind of basic. I mean, some places where a tree might be specimen or really valuable, you might go 1.5 times the inches in caliper or DBH in terms of radius. So 1 inch equals 1 foot protection, and it can be quite substantial when you're getting to big trees. But that really, I've done a lot of digging of trees and air spading of trees, and believe me, trees' roots go further out. So we may damage a few roots, but we at least want to have that critical root zone of protection. Yeah. Yes?
nobody can ever hear me, so.
That's okay.
In your research projects, have you looked at the difference between planting native plants as opposed to non-natives? And
we have looked at plants that are well adapted to the site. I am not a fan of, I'm not an ideologue in terms of natives or non-natives. In fact, on my woody plant database, all the plants that are native to North America, the native ranges of those plants are shown. So, I mean, Gleditsia, honey locust is a ubiquitous urban tree. It was never native in New York. I mean, we planted all over the place in New York. It was native up into Pennsylvania, but why shouldn't we plant Gleditsia? It's a great tree, and it's not invasive, and it's not, so I look at plants that are not invasive, but are well adapted to the site and pest and disease resistant. Yes?
Hi, I had a question because it seems very beneficial to do this process. If there's been any cost estimation done, if we wanted to help persuade the town to go through this, like per square, whatever.
Yeah, I haven't exactly done that. Depends on how much you can get compost at almost no cost. I mean, so the cost would be maybe like the backhoe getting in there and doing the work. The compost, most municipalities now are required to not put food waste into the landfill and green waste into the landfill, so that there are many, many compost operations, even in New York City, where institutions and groceries and so on have to take their food waste and compost it. So the cost of compost is really pretty low. It's just getting the machinery out there to do the scoop and dumping that is, you can't. We first started doing this with students and shovels. That wasn't very effective. I mean, you can go down maybe 8 inches with 40 students, but it's not really realistic. So the backhoe, the bucket is really realistic. And I haven't done a cost estimate, but I think that's the only cost that would be important to think about. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, we got some here. Argue over it, yeah.
We argue. Hi. Working the soil while it's wet causes compaction, yes, down to the structure, down to a molecular level. So, yeah. I mean, is that what you're witnessing by the incorporation of the organic matter?
Yeah, we don't want to wait when it's soaking wet. We will wait. It's best when it's moist to dry to do the incorporation. If it's saturated, we will wait, because that you won't get good incorporation. You'll create more clods than you breaking up, and so we won't do that.
My question has to do with contractors who are prepared to do this. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about New Jersey. You're probably more familiar with New York. Do you? Well, maybe your website has specs on what you need if you want to have your contractor do scoop and dump, and if tree planting contractors are usually are out there that are capable of doing this, or do you try to get a separate contract to have the soil prepared before your, say, street trees are planted?
Well, it depends on what kind of equipment your contractor has, and it doesn't have to be a big backhoe. So there can be a smaller backhoe, can be a very smaller bucket, but most contractors have that kind of equipment that I've worked with. They could get another subcontractor to do the scoop and dump as well. So I think either way would work. Yeah.
Hi, just wondering if there's like any additional steps between the scoop and dump and planting. So is there like a settling period, or do you want to water the soil in before you plant?
Yeah, that it looks pretty rough after we've scooped and dumped it. We might, where we've gone sometimes down as deep as 24 inches, and we get mounding up. We just smooth it with the bucket. So the bucket just kind of, instead of, we don't get a rototiller in there. Rototiller is not going to do anything that we want. So we just take the bucket and sort of smooth it down. That's all we do. Yeah.
our town has an area in the public land called Governor's Strip, which is about maybe 3 to 4 feet wide, where we would like to plant trees. There's on one side is sidewalk, on the other side is curb and road. Would it be worth scooping and dumping linearly next to the pit that you're going to dig to put the tree in?
Yeah, it would be beneficial, but I think there's another, so you have curb, green strip, sidewalk, and then what? Somebody's front yard?
Yes.
Okay, so we've done this, and I just didn't show it. We create breakout zones under the pavements. We take out 2 flags of the pavers, like 2 5x5 flags. We would scoop and dump the narrow tree lawn. This is before you could put after the tree, but often we do it before the tree. Then we take 24 inches down under the pavers, put structural soil, which is, Jason can tell you all about that, because we developed that at Cornell, and then repave, plant the tree. The tree roots use the amended soil, but that's not very much. And then they go underneath the pavement, the 2 flags, into somebody's front yard. Voila, they got lots of volume. So that's what, when you see a big old, Norway maple or whatever in a really narrow spot, their roots are not there. Their roots are somewhere else. So we're creating safe zones of passage, if you like, into somebody else's soil. They won't know about it, but the tree will do well. Yeah.
Is your procedure online?
Yes, and I'm reworking a bulletin on this, but I have a couple of pager and the spec for the soil, the compost. It's online, but I'm working up a bigger bulletin on that. It's on my to-do list. Yeah.
Yep. I got a question regarding, say, in an existing park, okay, with a lot of mature trees.
Yeah.
Okay, what we've been doing is we've been buying large trees that come in with the tree spade.
Yeah.
Now, bringing in equipment to scoop and dump is going to be compacting that soil even more so in the other areas. Now, any experience with that?
Well, you can use a bobcat. I mean, something smaller than a big old backhoe. So smaller scooping equipment, and you can actually put pallets or plywood to prevent. And you can that machine is not going to be moving all around. It's going to come into one spot, do the work, and move out. So you don't have to have it, circling the tree. And using a big, heavy plastic pallets or plywood will reduce the compaction. And I would use a smaller piece of equipment.
How about with the existing trees in the area affecting their roots?
Well, again, you have to come away from their roots in the critical root zone, so you're not going to be disturbing the tree next to it. You wouldn't plant a tree within the critical root zone of another tree, so you have to triangulate where that you could have that. Also, you need to see if you have a problem to begin with. Is the soil compacted? If it's not compacted, there's no reason to do this method. The other thing you can do to reduce compaction is you can add a really thick layer of, chips, like maybe 8 to 12 inches, and that also reduces the compaction on other trees. There's research showing that. It's not going to eliminate it, but it reduces the compaction on this kind of amount of chips will spread the load when a machinery comes across.
That might be a hard thing to put in an existing park and grass in there.
Yeah, I would just find out a place where you're not impacting other trees and take a smaller piece of equipment that can do the scoop and dump, and add some planks or plywood to reduce the load.
Right, but then when the tree spade comes in, we're getting.
Well, the tree spade in itself is a big piece of equipment. Yeah, so.
They usually come in, they scoop out, but I have an area now where I've lost like 5 trees that I have to remove. And I'm fighting with the county because they want a gazebo in there, and I don't want a gazebo. It's going to increase the compaction.
Right, there's always idiosyncrasies that you had to work around. Existing trees, what the soil is like, other construction. that's why we're in the urban environment. That's why it's a multidisciplinary field. We got to think about all these different things. I have to learn to talk engineer speak, to be able to talk to the engineers about a lot of different things. So it's a complicated area, but I think it's worthwhile doing. It's a simple technique. The scoop and dump it's not rocket science, but it's preparing a site for the tree instead of a hole for the tree. Preparing a site where those roots can get out, not a hole. That's the biggest thing. Yes. Oh, I don't know where we're going. Okay.
First of all, thank you for your research over the years. It's really been beneficial to the industry and for this presentation.
Who am I speaking
Way
to?
over here.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Can you discuss a little bit about the quality control of the compost, looking at pH, and it is variable depending on where you get it from.
Yeah, so that's why we came up with a spec for compost, because you can get compost. We had originally 9 different composts of different feedstocks that we tested in the greenhouse. And we had one from chicken manure. You could have blown, it was so hot. Those soluble salts were so high, and the ammonia was so high. I think it was not even compost. I think it was just dried, and it just totally killed everything. So you need to, that's why we went with the spec. So you need to have those soluble salts down below 4, and then, that's important because compost, there's not all composts that are created equal, and there's definitely some that could be detrimental. But if we're looking at 18 inches of incorporation of 6 inches, it's kind of a third by volume, they will dissipate as long as they're not too high to begin with. And pH, composts are typically high pH. If your soil is high, so what? If the soil is low, they'll raise the pH a bit. That might be a good thing. So yes, we look at pH all the time. The person next to you knows about that. Yes. Oh yeah, we do textural analysis. Yeah. No, we found that using sand or grits, you'd have to use about 3/4 of that to 1/4 of the heavy soil to make a difference. I mean, adding sand is actually worse than not adding sand. You have to use so much. You have to have about 75% sand to 25% soil to make a difference in that. So compost is a much better way of doing it. You're not only reducing the density, you're increasing the microorganisms, and it's basically, as we've seen in the results, it actually gets better over time as long as that organic matter is left to stay in the beds. Some people are really adamant about, raking out the beds. I said, just leave it in there. Rake the lawn, keep the organic matter in the beds. Sorry? It's okay. Just try again. Someone was.
We used to use 1/4-inch grits.
Yeah.
Which is what they used to put on the road for traction.
Yeah.
Texture of the soil. So when I did
Yep.
our soil, it was like the sand, silt, and clay. We tried to get like 75% sand because all of our beds always had French drains in them to improve the drainage.
Well, if you're going to add that much, you will get a difference. But you can't add 10%, 25%. You have to go over 50 to 75% to make that difference.
Yeah, because we absolutely had to have drainage in all of our soils.
But on the other hand, adding grits or sand is not going to give you anything in terms of nutrient availability.
No, the sand was terrible. It actually made the soil like concrete sometimes.
Yeah, if you didn't add enough, which is a lot, you get worse situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question right over here. Yeah, hi. Our town produces a large amount of leaf mulch from leaf collection, which they age 1 to 2 years. Could that be used as the compost material?
It can if it's composted. I mean, it's not just leaves.
No,
it has to be composted.
It's ground up, and it's
ground up, and then it has to be aged and aerated, and it has to be some carbon and nitrogen put in there so that you basically have a good compost over 6 months at least.
It looks almost like black soil when you get it.
Could be very good.
Yeah.
It needs to be tested, though. You can't just assume because it looks black, it's good.
Okay, we're running quickly out of time. Thank you, Dr. Bassett.